So an informal lease extension is where a tenant just agrees the terms of a lease extension with a landlord. A landlord under no obligation to offer any terms like that, but landlords quite often use it as a way to perhaps get a bit more premium, or actually not offer as much, but it's more attractive to a tenant because they can get it for cheaper. So rather than doing the sort of standard 90 years, which you would get on a statutory lease extension, they might say, I'll give you a new 99-year lease, which actually only gives them perhaps sort of an additional 40 years, and we'll keep the ground rent in there, but you can pay a bit of a smaller premium than you would pay for a statutory lease extension. So that's the sort of informal side, completely down to whether landlord and tenant can agree it between each other. Some landlords just will not entertain it at all, and they say, no, you can do the statutory side. Some landlords like to use it as a way to try and get the cash, so they will sort of entertain it a little bit as long as it suits them. The main focus of what I'll talk to you about today is the statutory side, because I think that will sort of fit in a bit better structurally with what you're all thinking about doing. And then it's just nice to know you've got the informal option, as if there is circumstances you can get something agreed, well, you might have that as an option. But the statutory side is got a bit more certainty to it. You know what you're getting at the end of it. Landlords are obliged to entertain the idea. They must grant a lease extension if a tenant satisfies the criteria. So there's more certainty when you're looking at buying a flat where you want the benefit of a lease extension claim assigned. You've just got that certainty there as to what you will actually be getting. So statutory lease extensions, the main sort of qualifying criteria is the 2 years ownership. And the whole process is started off by serving a notice of claim, often referred to as a section 42 notice, just because of the statutory provision. Before a claim notice is served, a tenant will usually speak to a solicitor to deal with the service of the notice for them, but will also take valuation advice from a surveyor specialising in these types of valuations. The valuer's report will give a run through of the property, obviously all of the reasons why they've come to the decision, but it will tell a tenant the premium that should be expected to be paid for their lease extension, and it will also give them advice to pass on to their solicitor as the premium to be proposed within the section 42 notice, which is always much lower than is anticipated they will actually pay, just to start the negotiating process off. It's worth noting that it's always worth getting that valuation advice at the beginning, because if you serve a section 42 notice of claim and you've just sort of plucked a figure out of the air as a premium that's sort of unrealistically low, then it can your notice can be deemed invalid if it's sort of unrealistic, the premium. It's got to be a realistic, reasonable premium that you're proposing. So valuation advice first. Serving section 42 notice of claim, served on the landlord, any intermediate landlords, any management companies, obviously whoever you've got acting for you on the legal side will be able to deal with all of that, but it's important that we've drawn all of the information about everyone that's got an involvement in the flat basically needs to be served with a notice. We serve notice of claim that initiates the claim for a lease extension, triggers a liability to pay 10% deposit to the landlord, which is 10% of the premium that you are proposing within that notice of claim, and it also triggers the tenant's liability to pay the landlord's costs. Landlord's costs, it's worth noting, a tenant's responsibility for costs is landlord's valuation costs, also landlord's costs in preparing a counter notice, also their cost in producing the new lease. A tenant is not responsible to pay the landlord's negotiating costs, either valuation or negotiating the terms of the lease. And if anything goes to a tribunal or court proceedings, which we'll come on to a bit later, landlord has to pay their own costs for that as well. So tenants' costs it's all monitored by statute, and it's those three things: valuation, counter notice, and the new lease, no negotiations. So section 42 notice is served, claims initiated. That section 42 notice has to give the landlord at least 2 months to serve their counter notice. Again, that date period is important, because if you if you mess your dates up slightly, not giving them enough time to serve their counter notice is a reason for your claim to be invalid as well. So that's an important time period.
Hannah,
Unfortunately,
sorry to interrupt. I've just had a note from one of the ladies. She's having issues with her Wi-Fi, keeps losing you. Is it possible just to slow down a wee bit so she can take notes?
Oh, sorry.
All
yeah.
right. Yeah, lovely. Thank you.
Sorry, right. So Section 42 notice served gives the tenant gives the landlord at least 2 months to serve their counter notice. Landlords often leave it for that period of time, mainly just a prioritising thing, but it's quite rare that you'll sort of get a counter notice back 2 weeks after you serve your initial notice. Normally takes a bit of time to get those back. Counter notices received. In the meantime, before serving their counter notice, a landlord has gone through the same process with their valuer. So their valuer will have prepared a valuation report, same advice. This is what we think the premium will be that your tenant will actually pay you, but here is the figure we think you should put in your counter notice, which will be a high figure. So it's one of these things that everyone just has to go through the dance of, it seems. Tenant starts low, landlord starts high, just so that there can be the negotiating to get somewhere in the middle, that hopefully it's in the same bracket that everyone's expecting.
Anna, sorry to interrupt. Apologies, I'm getting a bit confused. Maybe I'm the only one, but can I just ask a couple of simple questions at the start?
Yeah.
Would that be okay?
Yeah, of course.
So I know you're referring to tenant and landlord and things like that. So if we were potentially looking at a property that had a short lease, just as an example, and obviously that property right now, we've got an example of this that we sent to Jackie, but if
the studio.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So there's one there. There's also another one in Southall. So if I just go through it super quick, but that obviously property is very low on the market for a low price because of the lease is only 30 years. So for us to determine whether or not it's a good option for us, we'd obviously work with someone like yourself and figure it all out and get it evaluated. I think I understand that part. I guess one of my questions was, you said to actually get the lease extended, you have to be an owner for 2 years. Is that correct? I'm just trying to get my head around the kind of the initial part in some kind of simple terms.
Yeah, that is correct. The 2 years ownership is that is correct. What you'll be able to do, so when you're looking at the studio flats that you're looking at there, there's a process that can happen. So this Section 42 notice, serving that initiated claim, that must be served by someone who has owned the property for 2 years. So, or in your I'll come on to this sort of in a little bit, but we can just touch on it now. In your circumstances, what would happen is you would essentially say, yep, okay, we want to put an offer in, we'll buy your flat, it's been on the market for absolutely ages, we'll give you cash for it, we'll deal with the lease extension, don't you worry about that. But what you need to do, seller, is you need to give us the ability, which we do within the contract, whereas the notice of claim is served in the seller's name because it's the seller that has the right to make the claim, but they give you authority to deal with the lease extension claim on their behalf, so that you have control of that. And then we'll come on to talk about there's sort of a couple of ways as to how you can structure it with a seller, but essentially, in the short answer just for here is, the seller would have to initiate the claim. It would need to be the benefit of the notice would be assigned to you at the same time that you buy the flat. And I sort of touched on it a bit later on as to the different timings that you might want to buy the flat and have the benefit of the claim assigned to you. But you're exactly right.
Thanks, Hannah. That explains it, because I was trying to figure out in my head how you would ever determine what the lease impact would be if you weren't the owner, obviously, for 2 years, but I think you've just kind of covered that, so thank you.
Yeah, no, that's fine, not a problem. But yes, so it'll be seller that does it, and then it is possible to assign the benefit, and we'll come on to that in a little bit. So just sort of the run through of this for the timings of the whole sort of process. So counter notice is received from the landlord that there's sort of various things that are in there. Usually what happens is the landlord will admit the tenant's ability to make the claim, i.e. that the flat qualifies, they've owned it for 2 years and their notice was valid, and the landlord will give a counter proposal for the premium, which is usually higher. From the date that that counter notice is received, we then have a period of 6 months within which the terms of the lease extension are to be agreed. So that will be the form of the new lease and it will be the premium. So you've got the legal and the valuation side again. So both parties, both landlord and tenant, have their solicitors dealing with the lease and the valuers dealing with the negotiation on the premium that is payable. Again, time, I'm just sort of letting you know timings here because we'll come on to it, it'll be relevant later. That 6 month period is, again, it just comes down to landlords' priorities. Landlords like to exercise a bit of negotiating techniques, I suppose. So quite often a tenant will be, I've started my lease extension, come on, we just need to get on with it. Like, let's get this agreed. And then a landlord kind of takes the view of, well, how much do you want it done now? And they might be sort of hoping that a tenant will pay a bit more to get it done a bit quicker. And landlords just tend to leave them on the back burner until they get close to that 6 month time period. And then they'll engage a bit more, because if the terms cannot be agreed within 6 months, then that is when a claim would be made to a tribunal to ask the tribunal to determine the terms which haven't been agreed within that time period. A landlord doesn't want that to happen generally, because the landlord will have to pay their own costs in dealing with all of that. So you quite often find it that you'll sort of get up to about 4 months from counter notice and suddenly a landlord will decide it's in their interest to engage a little bit more with the process, because if they'll bring their figure down a little bit just to save any likely cost of a tribunal application. Once the terms are all agreed there, then there's another time period which then allows 4 months from when the date that the terms are agreed to when the lease must be completed. Any of these time limits, if they're not met, then a claim is deemed withdrawn, which will come on to what that means later. If the lease isn't completed in that 4 month period, then it is a claim to court to protect your claim, to deal with the completion of the lease. And on completion of the lease, that will be when a tenant pays the premium to the landlord, whichever has been agreed or determined, and also the landlord's costs is all paid at the end there on completion. The relevance of the time limits and potential withdrawal of the claim, a deemed withdrawal of the claim, if any of those time limits are missed, is if a lease extension claim, once a Section 42 notice has been served, at any time throughout the process, a tenant can expressly withdraw their claim. They can say, do you know what, I don't want to carry on with this anymore. Or it's deemed withdrawn if they miss any of the time limits. And that then, they still have to pay the landlord's costs that have been incurred up to that date. And it also then means that a tenant cannot serve another Section 42 notice. They can't initiate another claim for a lease extension until 12 months have passed. So obviously that's 12 months less on the lease, and your premium is likely to have gone up in that time because you're paying for more, essentially. So the timings there then, just to summarise, it can be sort of about up to 12 months from the start of a lease extension claim to when you complete. Average in practice that we usually see is probably about 6 to 8 months that it goes through. Sometimes you'll get it done really quick, and some landlords are quite helpful and they just take the view as to, well, we might as well get on with this, and yeah, we'll engage and it's all fine. Other landlords just sort of long it out. There are some landlords in central London that unfortunately take the view that they're going to sit there and wait until a tenant makes an application to the tribunal before they'll actually engage properly. And when landlords are a bit difficult like that, unfortunately, there's not much as tenants you can do. The only way that you can sort of force them to engage is by making a claim to a tribunal sometimes, but it's not often that you're making claims to tribunals. Usually they do engage, but a bit later on. So the court and the tribunals, as I say, we don't often, it's not it's not by far, it's not the norm that you're making a claim to a tribunal or a court during a lease extension, but it sometimes you can be forced to have to do it if you find that your claim is coming up against these time limits. You don't want your claim deemed withdrawn, so sometimes you're sort of forced to make a claim, which obviously there's additional costs on both sides for doing that, and it's quite an administrative burden if you get into directions of having to prepare the evidence for the tribunal to make a decision and everything, but sometimes it becomes a bit necessary. So that is the sort of run through of how these claims sort of work generally, and the time limits that we're talking about. Unfortunately, it's not sort of a quick thing that gets done in a few weeks, unfortunately. So if we now look at the studio flat that you mentioned, Neil, for example, that one that's been on the market for a little while, it's got a short lease on it. So thinking from the seller's point of view, a seller is going to have been, as soon as they put that property on the market, that seller will have been told it's going to be difficult for you to sell this with a very short lease. It's going to be very difficult for anyone to get mortgage finance for the property purchase because of how short the lease is. And really, seller, you should be trying to extend your lease before you market this property. So a seller that has been forced to put their property on the market before doing a lease extension is either hasn't got the time to faff about with it and just needs a quick sale, or they haven't got the cash to do it. So that's generally why you find those properties on the market like that. Mortgages, it varies. Some, most high street lenders have in recent times got a lot more hot on the unexpired term of a lease. Some say that they need 80 years to be on the left on the term at the beginning. Some are a bit more lenient, and some will get down to sort of, if you've got 40 years left at the end of the mortgage term, that's fine. It just varies. You can sometimes find some of the sort of more bespoke boutique lenders, if you've got an existing relationship with them as part of a property business, sometimes they'll sort of do very special rates and everything, sort of quite high rates if they're lending on something that's got a really short lease. But generally speaking, high street banks don't like lending on anything that, if you sort of think about the 60 to 80 year unexpired lease term, that's generally where you find most high street lenders. So with this one, as I understand it, the studio flat that you're looking at, it will be a cash purchase, is that right? Yeah, okay. So so the best way if you've got the cash available, the best way to get something like that agreed is that you can, and it's the most attractive to a seller, is as a buyer, you can approach a seller and say, we can get this done really quickly, we've got the cash available, we'll take all the hassle of the lease extension away from you.
Yeah.
So here's my nice low offer, and I'll just take the property away from you, no hassle whatsoever. The way that process would then work is that you would, so obviously contract for sale and purchase that you would usually have, but we include some additional provisions in there which will say that immediately after exchange of contracts, the seller will appoint you as buyer as their agent to deal with the initiating a claim for a lease extension. So there will then be provisions in there which then allow the Section 42 notice will sort of be agreed between them, so that'll be annexed to the contract, and the seller will then give you as buyer permission to serve a Section 42 notice in their name, because they must do it, because they're the only ones that have got the ability to do it.
And they're just authorising you to,
Exactly. So buyer's solicitor, so say I was acting for you, I would say, we want all of the control of this, it's our claim, we're paying for everything, we're doing everything, we just need to have the ability to put the seller's name on it, basically. We would deal with the service of the notice, we initiate the claim. At the time that claim is then initiated, we've then got a claim that's sort of in structure that we can then assign the benefit of. So we'll have about 2 weeks, say, between exchange and completion. Exchange happens, we serve the Section 42 notice of claim. That initiates the claim for a lease extension, which is at the crucial point. And then after that, we can deal with completion, which will be completing the transfer of the property, transferring legal ownership of that flat from the buyer to you. And it's crucially important that at the exact same time that we do that, so there needs to be provisions in the transfer that the benefit of the claim, the benefit of the notice that's already been served, is assigned to you. It's unfortunately, you see quite a lot where if that's not done at the exact right time and in the right way, that means the claim again is deemed withdrawn, and then unfortunately you've got the ownership of the property has then gone to a new owner that then has to wait 2 years to start all over again. So it's important that the contract provisions and the transfer provisions are correct, but it's easily done if you put the right bits in, basically.
And is that something you do with your solicitor? So you'd work with your solicitor to make sure that happens at the same time?
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, that's it.
So Hannah, a quick question on that one. If you were going to do that process, I'm thinking you'd probably want to know roughly what the lease extension would cost before you serve 42. So I probably appreciate there's probably a lot more to it, but how would you kind of get to, I guess, a higher ballpark figure of what that might be? Is there a process to do that?
Yeah. So really the best way to do it is that valuation advice that we sort of spoke about right at the beginning. So if you instruct a valuer that specialises in these things, they'll go have a look at the property. Sometimes they can do a desktop one, but they'll prepare a report that gives you the idea as to what should be paid to get that lease extension. There is you probably come across them. There's online lease extension calculators.
I've seen a couple of those.
Yeah, which they're useful to give a sort of ballpark. Sometimes some of them say that they can't be as accurate when the lease is really, really short.
That's what we saw.
Yeah, so when a lease drops below, when the unexpired term of a lease drops below 80 years.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying online.
Yeah, there's an additional part of the valuation formula that kicks in that it's called marriage value. That's just like it has a massive impact on the premium payable for a lease extension. Sometimes dropping below that 80-year point can as much as double the premium that you'll pay for a lease extension. It's sort of a real crucial valuation element that kicks in. So I think the online calculators just can't quite do that.
No, I actually looked at one this morning, and the online calculator, you're right, it didn't give us a number, because we looked at another place in Southall, and that's only got 31 years left on the lease. So the online calculators are hard to apply. But when we looked at the marriage value, I was trying to, in my head, figure out what that means, but it looks like it's kind of half the value of what the property would be post lease extension, or roughly. Is that correct, Hannah? Have we got that right? Or
I'll hold my hands up. Valuation is not my area. I'm very much the legal side and the value on that side. But I think it's my understanding of it is that you're on the right sort of lines. That it's essentially compensating the landlord for the loss of value in their freehold. So so I think.
So presumably that's all negotiable, because in terms of just a simple way of looking at, like at the Southall one, for example, that's on the market at 145. But if you look at the value of that with a standard lease, not the lease that's got now, you could argue it's about 295 in value, right? So if we were trying to look at a lease extension there, you might say, well, if the marriage value is half of roughly half of the overall property value, then you could expect to pay probably 100 grand for the lease extension, plus solicitor fees and other admin fees and that sort of thing. But I'm guessing, is that figure, is it negotiable? Is that's going to be the key thing for me, is just trying to get an approximate handle on that, because that's going to that's going to determine whether or not you're going to serve the lease in the first place, or you're going to go through the next steps.
Yeah, and I think the key thing for when you're making these considerations is going to be valuation advice. I mean, it may be that you've already sort of got some valuers that deal with that side, but I mean, I can certainly give you some contact details for valuers who we sort of work with regularly that do this. And then I think
yeah, that would be good.
Yeah, that'd obviously be, they wouldn't be able to give you sort of a off the cuff kind of thing, but if doing the valuations, they would be able to give you quite when marriage value is in, the negotiations are, there's more meat to the valuations, there's much more to negotiate, and there's a lot more sort of tangents that come into it with the value. So but the valuers will be able to give you a bracket as to where that premium should be at, because ultimately if when they're negotiating, landlord and your valuer are just so far apart and you end up going to a tribunal, both valuers would then have to put their evidence to the tribunal to persuade the tribunal that their valuation is right. So valuers know that is ultimately where they might get to when they're doing these valuations. So they always have confidence that their calculations are robust enough to stand up to a tribunal when they're doing it. So they can be quite confident in giving you, and it's usually sort of, I mean, well, it depends what you're looking at, but it's always a bracket that they give you. They won't be able to say, oh, it will be £5,000 or whatever.
It's always an estimate. Understood. Yeah, there's other variables.
But they can do, a lot of valuers can do these valuations sort of by a desktop survey, particularly if a property is on the market, because if they can get the sort of square footage and things like that, and particularly if they can see pictures of inside and the condition of it, quite often they can do it as a desktop without having to actually go in and visit the property, which can sometimes make the valuation cost a little bit cheaper.
What's the typical sort of ballpark figures for evaluation? Are we talking, 500 quid, a couple of grand? What would be a rough idea?
I would say they're usually between sort of 500 to 850, something like that, plus VAT on it. But hopefully I haven't just offended all of my valuer contacts when I've just held them.
Just a rough idea. Yeah, it's kind of similar to a house valuation and structural valuation for
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of that sort of ballpark, and then that will give you their valuation report, gives you all of their calculations that they've used, gives you the bracket that they think it should be, and it gives you sort of advice as to where you should pitch your initial notice, which is obviously helpful to start there. So I think if you're particularly where you're looking at them with that shorter lease on, then I would definitely, I think you've already sort of got just a bit, but definitely valuation advice before you start
offering on
section 42, well, before probably you even start putting an offer in, because the amount that you end up paying for a premium for a lease extension can just vary drastically depending on the value of the property, where it is, everything like that. So valuation advice, I would say, is sort of key as to when you're considering any of these proposals. I would think. So does that answer the question?
It does. Thank you.
So then with if we do it by that process where you have contract for sale and purchase, then buyer deals with the serving of the claim, and then the benefit is assigned at the same time that the property is bought. At that point, the seller literally drops out of the picture. So seller gets their purchase price cash, they walk away, they don't have anything else to do with the lease extension. We notify the landlord on your behalf that the benefit of this claim has now been assigned to you, and you're now dealing with the claim through. We're your lawyers, everything comes to us. Seller has absolutely nothing to do with it. You have your solicitor, your valuer doing all the negotiations, and everything carries on from there. As you sort of alluded to, the risk in that on your side is that at that point where the seller sort of drops out of the picture, you don't have any certainty as to what the premium is going to be, sort of where you're going to get to in your negotiations. Are you going to have to make a claim to the tribunal if the landlord really won't negotiate with you? If your timescales get tight due to sort of any reasons, are you going to have to make an application to the tribunal or to the court to protect those? You can get a really good indication as to what the premium should be and what your legal and your surveyor costs should be, but that it's just always worth noting that with lease extensions, because you've got this potential tribunal and the potential court, applications that sometimes just become necessary to protect your claim, it just makes it that little bit of uncertainty. But
I'm guessing that also, you could probably do your research on the buyer as well before that to say, well, what's their urgency on selling it? Are they, theoretically willing to play ball? I guess, what they're, because you raised a good point there, which is, I think that there's they don't always have the cash to do it. So that could be a good opportunity, because if someone's overseas or whatever, or they don't have the cash, then you sort of think, well, that could be a good opportunity for people like us.
Yeah. I mean, and I think you can, it's particularly where you've got a property that's been on the market for a long period of time, you've got a really short lease like this, the only real people that are going to look at it is investors or cash purchase, basically. Exactly. So a seller is essentially in a bit of a tough situation there, and I think you can definitely compensate your potential risks of additional costs in the lease extension by having your purchase price really nice and low, that should still be attractive to a seller, because they're getting cash in their hands quite quickly, they're walking away from it, and you're taking all the risk through. So I think that can be compensated in the purchase price, and that's sort of a bit of a negotiation with the seller. But particularly where the properties have been on the market for a little while, it's and if it can sort of be sold to them in that way, then it's that should sort of help you.
Great. Thanks for answering more questions. I've got to run, but I've got to jump on.
Right, thank you.
Anna, could I just ask a question leading on from that? So if you negotiate with the vendor that you exchange with a delayed completion subject to the extension being granted, that would be possible to do that, would it?
Yeah, that's literally my next.
Sorry.
Okay. No, that's fine. So that situation that we just spoke about there works really well for. It's nice and attractive to a seller because they get their cash and they walk away nice and quickly. If you've got cash available that you can do it, it's easy. It's most attractive to a seller, and then seller's out of the picture nice and quick, and you can just crack on with your lease extension claim. That doesn't work, unfortunately, if you need mortgage finance for the purchase price of the flat. So the way that you might be able to do it that way is you would exchange contracts. So you have your current owner of the property, the seller, you as investor buyer exchange contracts with the seller that you will purchase the property, but that completion will be on notice when you agree a lease extension. So we always have to put a long stop date in these, and this is the bit that will be maybe a bit difficult to persuade a seller. But if we've got a nice desperate seller that actually just wants to get someone on the hook to buy their flat, we might be able to do it. Long stop date, you're probably looking at about 18 months. Just to allow the time for that whole process that we spoke about at the beginning to go through, with a bit of leeway in case we need to make a quick tribunal application in there as well. And then what would happen is the same principles that we spoke about in the last scenario, where seller gives you buyer authority to serve a Section 42 notice of claim, because it still all has to be in seller's name, because they are the ones with the right to make the claim. And you as buyer would then go off and deal with the whole lease extension process, whilst the seller still owns the property. And then when you get to a point that everything's agreed, you've got your premium agreed, you've got your lease agreed, we're getting close to everything's set up for completion, we then go back to property owner, seller, and say, actually, we've got everything agreed now, we're ready to complete. We'll give them notice, and then we line up completion on the same day. That essentially you can then, if there's a mortgage involved, when we're reporting to your mortgage provider, we will essentially be saying to them, when you are lending on this property, you're lending with its nice long extended lease, the 30 years left plus the 90 years that you'll get from this lease extension. So that's what the bank is looking at, nice long lease. On the day of completion, they release their monies. We send some of it to the purchaser, to the seller to buy the property from them, and we send some of the money to the landlord to complete the lease extension. Obviously lots of contractual provisions as to how that money all moves around, but essentially everything can happen on the same day, so that you then buy your property with the nice long lease, seller's got their cash, landlord's got their premium, and you've got your mortgage all happening on the same day. That is obviously ideal from a cash flow point of view, if you don't want to be giving out the purchase price sort of before you're getting your nice long lease. It's not as attractive to a seller, but again, it just depends on what circumstances the seller's in. If they've had their property on the market for a year already, then actually, like, if they've got someone on the hook as such to buy it, then they might be willing to entertain those long periods. I would expect still in those circumstances that you as buyer would indemnify the seller for sort of all of the costs and everything like that incurred in it. And obviously a seller is going to want to make sure that you are on the hook to pursue that lease extension all the way through and to buy the property. Remembering that if a claim is deemed withdrawn or expressly withdrawn, it means that we have to wait 12 months before we can start again. So a seller is just going to want to be very careful not to end up in a situation where they let someone else start off their claim for a lease extension, and then actually they get cold feet and pull out, and then sellers left then with a property that they've still got to try and sell, but now they've got to wait a whole year where their leases got even lower before they can get another buyer, basically. So that's all sort of things that a seller would be worried about, but it's just worth bearing in mind that you'll probably have to give them assurances that you're going to do it all, you're going to pay the cost for everything, and you just need them to let you do it, and they can just sit and wait while you get on with everything, basically. But ultimately you'll get their cash at the end of it.
A quick question, Hannah. Do you have to pay stamp duty on the premium on the lease extension? And also, if it's a second property, do you have to pay the 3% surcharge on that premium?
Yes, so lease extension, if it is an additional property, then yes, the 3% does apply, and the stamp duty is on things that it's above 40,000. So if your premium is above 40,000, then you'll be looking at stamp duty on that. Yes.
And is that on the whole 40,000, or anything only like 3% on 40,000 and above?
It's
so say for example it was 60,000, you only pay stamp duty on 20,000.
I'll double check. I'll follow that up with Jackie. I think you'll only pay where it's a lease extension and it's a second property. I think you only pay the 3% on the bit above the 40,000.
Right.
That would be the usual circumstances, but I just wanted to double check that before any of you write that down as certainty. So I will double check that as soon as I get off here, and I'll send Jackie an email which she can send on to all of you.
Thank you.
So Hannah, just to clarify on the stamp duty aspect there, let's suppose we're doing one with an exchange for delayed completion or an option, and we've got the purchase price of the flat and we've got the lease extension price. The stamp duty is payable on the purchase price or the purchase price plus the lease extension?
So they will be treated as two separate transactions. So it will be on both, essentially. So yeah, your purchase price, normal stamp duty rules apply, and then the premium that you're paying to the landlord, I think it's just on the bit above 40,000, but I'm going to check that. But it will be treated as two separate transactions for stamp duty purposes.
So just to recap then, Hannah, thank you. It's a lot of information. So what we're looking for is a seller who is extremely motivated to sell, a lease extension maybe under a decade or so, possibly a probate, some beneficiary taking care of it. Okay. Yeah. And then the exchange and completion. So you have a long stop date when it's the completion on notice of the lease extension. So your long stop dates are usually around 18 months with some leeway to account for any tribunals as well. Okay.
The way that we would structure we would have it so that we exchange contracts, and then the way that the completion date would be defined is that we would try and do it so that completion will be on notice from the buyer that a lease extension has been agreed. That will give you the most flexibility that as soon as you've got your lease extension agreed, you can turn to your seller and say, okay, we're all ready to go. Come on, like, let's get on with this. That might be 6 months, that might be 8 months, that might be a year. The purpose of a long stop date is just because you always have to have that certainty in a contract, so that essentially both parties know that this isn't going to be lingering over them forever, and that if things aren't done by that date, then the contract will sort of fall away and everything will go. So the long stop date, the reason why I would say 18 months, you might even want to go longer than that, but that should give you enough time to follow through that whole process, with the time if you need to make a tribunal application. But hopefully your lease extension process would go in the sort of usual 6 months, and it would be 6 months time that you go to the seller and say, okay, we're ready to buy your property now, and complete the lease at the same time. The long stop date is just to allow you the time if you need it.
And the mortgage offer is released on the day that the lease has been extended. So we're saying to the mortgage lender here, this is like over, I don't know, 15 years plus the additional 90 years as well. And then the seller obviously gets that cash, which has been pre-negotiated at a much lower price, given the urgency of the lease being very short, so ideally under a decade or so.
Yeah, I mean, I think any seller anyone that owns a flat that is trying to sell it with a lease that's below 60 years is in a difficult situation to sell, really. So yeah, I mean, the lower the lease is, the more tricky situation they're in. But it's going to be difficult for them to sell if they're around sort of 60 years.
Thank you.
So just thinking, Hannah, if trying to make it attractive to the seller, could you, I mean, if you do it on exchange with delay completion, to make it attractive to them, could you actually say, let's do a long stop of, I don't know, 9 months, but with a clause in there that if the negotiations are ongoing, that can be extended?
Yeah, you can do. You can sort of phrase it in a number of ways. So you'll always, if you can do it that way, which you're right, it might sound a bit more attractive to a seller, because you're focusing on a period of 9 months rather than 18 months. But what you would still need in there, just to make the contract valid for certainty, is you would need, sometimes if we've got a long stop date that can be extended, we refer to the other date as a drop dead date. So there would still need to be a date in there somewhere by which point all of this comes to an end, if it absolutely has to. But that might, you're right, that might be more attractive to a seller, because you can focus on this 9 month long stop date that might be extended for XYZ, even though you've got your drop dead date that then can be a lot later.
Okay.
Hannah, I've got a question. Maybe it's not for you, maybe it's more for a mortgage broker. But will the lenders lend on the value as exchanged, or on the value that's been improved as the completion of the lease extension goes through? Which number do they use?
It will be the number that will be relevant as to when their charge latches onto the property. So it will be with the extended lease.
Okay, all right. So somewhere in there, they'd need to come up with a valuation figure that's allowing for the fact that the lease extension is going through.
Yeah.
Okay, so that, I guess once you've got notice that the lease extension is going to happen, you then turn to a mortgage broker, give them all the information, at which point a valuer can take that into account.
Yeah, exactly. So for your mortgage, the point of view from your mortgage is that essentially the way that you would package it to a bank is that when you'll package it to them that they are lending on a property that's got this really long extended lease, and in reality it would be that you are dealing with the lease extension as part of the sale, but you almost don't need to broadcast that to the bank. You can just say, at the time that we complete, we're going to have this new lease that's nice and long, because that's all they really need to know about. That's when their charge attaches onto the property.
Okay.
So that is what they need to know. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay. Any more questions at the moment? Nope. So I think that's with your long completion date, with you buying it with the benefit of a mortgage. And yeah, I think it's just a case of whether or not you can sell the idea to a seller. Another way that Jackie and I briefly spoke about when we spoke, and I thought it might be worth just mentioning, is if you wanted to ultimately sell to a third party. So you are so we'd follow the same process that we just spoke about with the idea of you getting a mortgage at the end of it, but rather than you getting a mortgage at the end of it and then taking the cash from the mortgage provider to then send on to seller and landlord respectively, you would ultimately get the cash from a third party buyer. Works in very much the same way as that process that we just spoke about, except you would have a second contract with your buyer, where the completion dates needed to link. Again, it's just a bit more drafting in the contract, but it can certainly be done if you can. So whilst you're dealing with your lease extension process, you'd also be marketing the property. You can market the property with the benefit of a lease. So rather than the particulars that you're looking at the moment, have the property there, oh, but by the way, we've only got 30 years left on the lease, you would be same way, but oh, you'll be buying it with this lovely all singing, all dancing lease extension that we're going to give you with it. So the idea obviously being that the money that you're getting from your buyer will hopefully be a bit more than you're paying on to your seller and the landlord for the lease extension, and doing it that way. I think that's sort of a good way to do it, and it then makes it, you sort of essentially, you'll be getting an uplift on the price, hopefully, for having dealt with the faff of a lease extension, basically. And you then make the property much more attractive to other buyers, because you take away this difficulty in getting a mortgage because you're giving them an end product with a long lease. But we still just need to think back to our sellers' concerns, that a seller is going to want to make sure that you are on the hook to definitely buy that property, to definitely follow through with the lease extension, and they're not going to end up with a property that they now have to wait another 12 years before they can do a lease extension. So it will just be worth bearing in mind that if you don't, you'll be very, again, it comes to negotiation, but I think it would be very unlikely that you could persuade a seller to exchange contracts with you for you to deal with your lease extension, but oh, by the way, we're only actually going to buy it if we can get a third party buyer. I think you would find that you would have to put yourself on the hook to buy it with your seller, but that ultimately you could flip it on if you needed to. And then if all that lines up on the day of completion, you'll then have all the cash coming from, whether they've got a mortgage or not, coming from end buyer through you. You send some to the ultimate seller and some to the landlord to deal with the lease extension. And again, everything happens on the same day. So that is a very whistle-stop tour there. I feel like I've been talking for a very long time, but I appreciate I've bombarded you all with an awful lot of information that isn't sort of your usual dealings, and we've sort of flown through it all. But any more questions, obviously more than happy to.
What are the most common, sorry, Kevin, you go first, Kevin, if you want.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. Hannah, from your experience, say you have someone who has a property that has, as you've said, a very short lease of 60 years or so. Typically, again, from your experience, what would be a lease extension that you would go for? Would it be 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, or more than that? And the second question, while you're thinking about that, is this whole business of lease extension, is it, again, a very, very niche part of the property business, or is it something that is actually gaining popularity with people like yourselves who know this sort of stuff? Where does it sort of fit in the whole strategy of property?
So first question, with the length of the lease extension, if we are dealing with the statutory lease extensions, it is always an additional 90 years on top. So the statutory, the new lease that you get through a statutory lease extension is an additional 90 years on top of your unexpired lease term. So whether you've got 90 years left already, whether you've got 50 years, whether you've got 10 years, your entitlement is always to an additional 90 on top of that. The other terms of the lease extension, just quickly, are that your ground rent will be a peppercorn, so you don't pay any ground rent, and all of the other terms of the lease of the flat stay the exact same unless there's a defect in there. So for example, if there was something wrong with your original lease, like it didn't actually give you a right of way over the stairs to get up through the landing to your front door, that's something we could correct in the lease extension. But if we just actually fancied the right to use that garden down the road, please, then we can't go changing the lease entirely, but we can correct defects. But so the terms of the lease, as in the additional years and the ground rent and what you can actually do with those other terms of the lease, are quite prescribed by statute. So that's sort of where we'd go through there. If you did negotiate an informal lease extension with the landlord, which is, as I said at the beginning, entirely sort of, their discretion, sometimes then you might find yourself in a negotiating position as to the number of years, but you don't really want to, if a landlord is offering you an informal lease extension, you want to be making sure really that your extended lease has got at least 125 years on. And second question, where it sort of fits in, I think it is a little bit of a niche area amongst lawyers. Not everyone deals with it, and a lot of people aren't particularly keen on dealing with the assigning of benefits of the claims with buying and selling, because it is a sort of a little bit niche, but it's certainly something that that's sort of been around and that people have to deal with. Whether or not it's getting, I think perhaps it's getting a little bit more popular and a little bit more well known now, because lenders have recently got a lot hotter on the terms of leases that they will accept. So a lot of people have had to turn to lease extensions because they've struggled with lenders, whereas before I think the lenders were they sort of left it a bit more to the solicitors, just to, oh, you tell us if you think there's a problem, and then most of the time it's fine because there isn't enough left for their mortgage term. But they've got a lot more prescriptive now, where we must have at least this, or you must tell us if this is a problem. So it's perhaps become a bit more into the public domain as such from that. But yeah, I think it's if someone's got the cash available, I think it's a good way to take properties at a lower value, because sellers who have a really short lease and they don't have the cash available to do it themselves are in a real tricky situation. So certainly when if you find someone that's unfortunately put their property on the market to sell without having checked the length of their lease, and then the first time their short lease is coming to attention is when they've instructed their solicitor to send the title over to their buyer, and then it's a really short lease, and then their sale falls through because the lease isn't long enough, and it puts them in a really tricky situation, because the market is just so contracted for them to cash buyers. So if you're in a position where you can if you can deal with a bit of the faff, for want of a better word, of the lease extension, and actually it ends up paying off financially for you, then I think there's definitely a market there, because a lot of people that are buying properties for themselves to live in or anything, they just don't want the additional admin of when they're buying it.
What's your? Oh, sorry, Mark. Sorry.
That's okay. I was just clearing my throat, ready to say something. Go on.
So you had a question. She disappeared.
Sorry, slight distraction going on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, bit of an interruption with the homeschooling job. Oh. Just trying to work out where the creation of the cereal box is. Sorry, I am mad. It's true. Hannah, I was just going to ask, without wishing to sound negative, but looking just to assess the kind of risks with this sort of thing, because I had a look at several properties in South London about a year ago, which had short leases. And this is really interesting in that respect. So what would you say are the key problems that you encounter when you're doing these sorts of arrangements? What would be the top things that kind of holes that people fall into or potentially fall into?
I think it's just acknowledging the timescales that are involved, acknowledging the timescales and at the points that you need the cash available is sort of a key thing in setting it up. The legal process has got a fair few pitholes in as to the validity of your initial notice. There's quite sort of strict criteria that your notice of claim needs to follow. The timescales are really, really important, and the assigning the benefit thing, that all needs to happen at the exact right time, so it's deemed to have gone. So they're pitfalls, but they're legal pitfalls that are sort of more your solicitor's problem as such.
Yeah.
But they need to make sure that they've got sort of lined up for you. But I think from your point of view, it is just getting all of the information that you can at the beginning. So the valuation advice right at the beginning, so that you can really sort of look at the whole process. Obviously, in given situations, like your lawyers can give you an indication of cost estimates, and we can also give you an indication as to sort of worst case scenario, for want of a better saying, as to if we ended up in a really difficult negotiation where we were at tribunal, we were having to follow the directions all the way through. You can sort of get an idea of the costs that might come through for you. You can also get quite a good idea of what the landlord's cost that you're likely to pay should be, because it's all governed by statute. If the landlord presents you with a massive great big bill at the end, or this is my valuation cost and this is my lease cost and everything like that, there's the ability that you can challenge that at the tribunal, the costs. So
sorry to ask this, I haven't been through a tribunal for this, but I've been through an education tribunal all the way through.
Yeah.
And I started off with one cost valuation from the solicitors, and let me just tell you, it was 3 times as much as that.
Yeah.
And it was quite horrendous. So I would be, now we're talking about this, I'm thinking, actually, maybe this isn't a strategy for me.
Yeah. So I think.
Yeah, go on.
I think they are. This is. They really don't often end up in a tribunal. They really don't, and it's often when you do end up in a tribunal that you might make an application to a tribunal to force the landlord to take it seriously and to get on with it. It's very rare that it goes all the way through, but if it does go all the way through, you'll have your sort of standard directions that you need to comply with, that you need to give the valuation, you need to send all your evidence in and everything like that. So I think you should be it's a little bit different. I can completely take on board your concerns as to with an education tribunal is sort of it's a different end of the spectrum of the tribunal process with this. So this should be a lot simpler tribunal process, even if it did go all the way through, just because ultimately it's will come down to valuation, and it will be the valuers presenting their evidence to the tribunal. The tribunal take both sides' evidence. The tribunal quite often go and visit the property themselves, and the tribunal can actually sort of act as a bit of, they don't need to go with either party. They're allowed to view the property themselves and sort of make their own view and take a bit from what they say and a bit from what they say, and then they say, well, this is what we think. So it's not as much of sort of lots of different people getting involved, and we might have a little hearing to deal with this, and then we might have another hearing to deal with that. It's more streamlined of a process of sort of evidence gathering, paper pushing to the tribunal, and then it's sort of left to them to get on with it. It's always difficult to give an indication of costs, but I find that if you it's easier. I would be able to give you just speaking for me personally, a worst case scenario, that if we ended up at a contested hearing, having done all that, I could give you an indication as to what I think those costs would be. it would probably be a very scary number that you don't really want to be hearing. But I could give you an indication as to what that's likely to be, just because I would know the amount of time that it's likely to take us to prepare all of the evidence and to get your valuer down to the tribunal and to do that. But I can also give you the figure that we'll be looking at, that if we did have to make that tribunal application just to force the landlord to sort of pay attention as such, and then it would just be time in drafting the application, in serving it at the tribunal and on the other side, and we have to deal with the first round of directions, and then that's generally where you get to when you'll then get an agreement, and then we can withdraw the tribunal proceedings. And obviously costs involved in that bit are going to be very different to the worst case scenario, but it is, you can't get away from the fact that there is ultimately that end risk that if you start a lease extension claim, particularly where you've got a seller that makes sure you're on the hook to really follow it through, there is the risk that if you've got a real difficult landlord to negotiate with, that they might force you to argue it all the way through. I mean, the other option is, with going to a tribunal, it is always a bit of a cost escalating, and what's the tribunal going to decide? You might take the view with your valuer and say, do you know what, that is just a potential for escalating costs and we don't actually know the end decision. You might say to your valuer, just literally negotiate the best possible deal that you can get, and take the view that even if it's a bit higher than what you'd like to pay, there's still the option to agree something, so you've got a set figure without triggering that whole procedure. It sort of comes down to...
I mean, it all fits with my experience to a certain extent with the with the education tribunal. We tried all those things, and that's, you know, that was very difficult in that situation, but at least I know, at least I've gone through it. So that's helpful actually to have a worst case scenario, because at least if you know what it is and you still decide to engage, then you know what you're what the potential is. You know, you've got kind of, like you said, this spectrum, and you know whether the sort of prize at the end is worth it. So thank you.
That's okay.
Thank you. I'm going to have to go actually, because I've got another call coming up.
Okay.
So thank you very much. Nice to meet you and other people as well. Hope to see you again soon.
Okay, guys. I'm looking at the time. It's 11:10. If we've got any more, just one more question for Hannah before we let her go.
I've got a question, if that's all right. Hi, Hannah.
Hello.
I found 3 flats in the same block, but they actually only have 8 years left on their lease.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Now, you said with the statutory lease extension, that would bring you an additional 90 years, and then you'd hope for it to have over 125 afterwards. Is that right?
If you were just looking at a new lease, or if you were able to negotiate with your landlord on an informal basis, you would ideally want a lease to have at least 125 years on it, ideally. But in your situation, that probably wouldn't be achievable, because if you were just I expect a landlord would negotiate very heavily on if they've only got 8 years left. So statutory lease extension, you would still get that 90 years. So it would take your lease to 98 years on it. And then, it's long enough. It's long enough to get a mortgage on it, and it's fine. And with a lease extension, you can always do another one. So say for some reasons, someone came along and said, well, actually, I really want it to be longer than 98 years. They could do another claim for another lease extension straight afterwards if they wanted to. But your 98 years would be long enough to get a mortgage. It's long enough to sort of be set.
To be long enough to kind of sell it on.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So you wouldn't avoid that situation then? No. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Hannah, that's been really educational. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. Guys, I think what you've all learned here today is that you need a lawyer who absolutely knows what they're doing, and clearly Hannah does. So I will post Hannah's contact details on the Dropbox folders, and then obviously if you have any lease extensions that you need to do, then please do put your business through Hannah.
Happy to help. Yep. And I do appreciate it's an awful lot of information. And as I was sort of writing my little how I was going to go through, I thought it's an absolute brain dump on you. So apologies for that. But if you've got any questions, obviously, that you want to follow up afterwards, let me know. That's fine.
Thank you, Hannah.
Okay.
Yes, thanks, Hannah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Hannah. I think rather than keeping you any longer, because we've extended our 60 minutes here, but I'll be in touch with you either by email or just give you a call, and we can go from there. All right, lovely. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Nice to meet you all.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Hannah.
guys. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, guys, interesting?
Yeah,
Very
definitely.
good.
Yeah.
Enjoyed it.
Yeah, that's good.
She is very giving with her time, so you know, please don't take advantage of that. But if you do have any questions, then she's more than happy to answer. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Lizzie, 3 in a block with 8 years. Wow.
Yeah.
We definitely need to look at that one.
Yeah, I know.
They're going to be.
When
I think the marriage premium on that's going to be horrendous.
It will be, yeah.
okay.
Yeah, I think they're gonna. That's probably a tribunal one. I think.
Yeah.
Really?
I
I like a challenge.
It is a good point, because I'm wondering if there is an optimum, you know, like, is 30 years like an optimum, whereby if you go like down to 20, 25, 8 years, it becomes not worth the hassle?
Yeah, which one's ideal?
That's what I guess.
Well, I think you've got to look at it from, let's suppose you're the freeholder.
Yeah.
All right. So put yourself in their shoes. 8 years left. I'm going to negotiate the fuck out of that one.
Yeah, exactly. Get the
I've
maximum
got
I can.
that flat in 8 years otherwise.
Yeah.
So I'm going to push hard, and I'm not going to agree, and I might go to tribunal, because don't forget, costs up to a point are still paid by the flat owner, the leaseholder.
Yeah.
Yeah. So. And they're paying my costs up to that point. Tribunal, I think, I couldn't remember what Hannah said, whether it's
they pay their own.
Yeah. So
yeah,
you know, it's a judgment call, but with only 8 years left, I would take that judgment call. So yeah, I'm going for that one.
Really, the short. Yeah. So really, the shorter the lease, the more you can the more you can negotiate. Really.
Yeah.
Should be able to.
Yeah, I think you know, probably best leases are. From what I've seen, and I've not done, you know, these, so more 60 years or more, I think is probably okay. Less than 60 years, I think it's going to be a hard fight, personally. Just think of, you know, simplicity. You know, I don't even remember from the 2 day, but we heard an example of one of our mentees that had actually done this.
Yeah.
And it did add a bit of value, but and they were going from, I think it was 75 years plus the 90. That is enough value, you know, an extra 20 grand or something to the sale of their property.
I mean, they when they first put it on the market, that they were a typical example of what Hannah was talking about. They didn't appreciate that 75 years left on the lease would be an issue with the lender. So they applied for the extension. They were quoted 17,000, and Faye, she was a buyer at the time for who was it, Mark? John Lewis. Yeah. So she had good negotiation skills. So she went back to the freeholder and negotiated it down to 9,000, and that was including costs. So it's possible to do it, and that took 4 months in total. When they put it back onto the market, they achieved another 125. They achieved another 25,000 on top of their buy price. So take the 9,000 from that, they've still achieved an extra 16,000 in 4 months.
Wow.
Yeah, my flat that I sold had 50 to 55 years left on the lease, and I think the premium, if I remember correctly, cost about 30 plus grand. This was in Reading. But I remember trying to sell it, or trying to get offers pre getting the lease done, and I think I had cash 100, probably 170 was one of them. Getting the lease done, I sold it for 274.
Wow.
So it is worth it if you're able to do it. And I know we were talking about assisted sales. This is almost like an assisted sale, effectively.
Absolutely.
So
Pete, so I've got to love you and leave you. I've got another place to be. So
All right, Glenn.
thank you very much.
Take care.
Have fun.
Good. See you soon.
Yeah, bye.
You could do the same on an option. No different really. The only thing I'd question on the option is if you've got a large premium to pay, it's much better on an exchange with delayed completion. But on the likes of that one, 30 grand is not really a large premium. The ones with can't remember their names now, Owen and Faye, they ended up paying 10 grand. That was an option for me. An 8-year one, that's an exchange with delayed completion all day long if you're going to do it.
Yeah.
But I mean, you have to consider some of the central London flats that Dewey and Lizzie are looking at. The lease extensions are hundreds of thousands of pounds. So, you've got to make sure you've got your right solicitor to deal with this, because, I think they're key in the whole process here.
Yeah.
I remember when we kind of met up a while ago, there was a website that you could find flats with short leases.
Yes, it's Property Data.
Okay.
It is a subscription, Jonathan.
Yeah.
But it's something like £9 a month, Mark, isn't it? Property Data.
I think it starts about 9 or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
The lowest one.
Yeah. But you can do a search for short leases in any particular area. So it's certainly what Dewey and Lizzie, who are looking at doing this as a strategy, are using.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, guys.
Okay.
Glad you enjoyed it. I will.
Yeah, it was great.
Good.
Thank you.
Guys.
Yeah, post her details on the Dropbox folders, and if you have any further questions or you need a lawyer, then do use her, because she's certainly been very helpful and been recommended to me by our broker that we've used for donkey's years. Actually.
Where is she based?
I've no idea.
Okay.
I've no idea.
Doesn't matter now. It's all online anyway.
Yeah.
So. That's cool. Thanks.
All right, guys. Speak to you soon. Have a good day.
Bye.
Enjoy your long weekend.
Yeah, have a good weekend.
Stay safe.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.